In the nearly 8 months Russia has been assaulting Ukraine, Ukrainian forces have mounted a remarkable defense, holding back invading forces in much of the south and east from advancing towards Kyiv, even making advances, reclaiming some territory. But in recent weeks, the Kremlin has been bombarding the capital and other strategic Ukrainian cities from above with a stockpile of Iranian drones. One of the latest attacks killed at least 4 people in a residential building. Several of the others have targeted water supplies, electricity facilities, and other key infrastructure. All of it is prompting renewed war crime allegations against Russia, and the UN's on-the-ground coordinator in Ukraine is calling the situation on the ground utter devastation, telling CNN she is absolutely convinced of a high risk of mortality during the winter months, with families and communities who have been left with absolutely nothing. I'm joined now by the Washington Post reporter Missy Ryan, just back from Ukraine. Carol Saivetz is a senior advisor for MIT's Security Studies program and a research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Institute. Carol, Missy, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Carol, starting with you, more and more analysts I follow are saying Russia is losing the war. Do you agree with that? And what does that actually mean?
I was going to ask you, what does that mean exactly?
I'm just repeating the words.
I understand. It seems to me that Russia has lost certainly the public relations aspects of the war. I mean, with the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the successes that they've had, and with the world condemnation of this intensive bombing and missile attacks over the last couple of weeks. I think the question that we all need to grapple with is whether Russia thinks it can continue these attacks in order really to hurt the Ukrainians throughout the winter, at which point either they're hoping that the Ukrainian population will say we've had enough, or whether by turning off the energy spigot, there'll be a split in the NATO-US alliance in terms of continuing to support Ukraine and providing weapons.
You know, Missy, most of the people I've heard say that have not done what you've done, been on the ground in Ukraine. You're just back a couple of days. What's your reaction to those kinds of statements?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does make sense to question the psychological effect of these strikes on Kyiv, which, as your viewers know, has been relatively quiet for months as the fighting has gone on in central and eastern Ukraine. But I actually was there last week when the first of the current wave of strikes hit downtown Kyiv, cruise missiles and other kinds of attacks. And it really was, I think, a wake-up call to residents of the capital. But what we'd heard, rather than fear, fear of for people's lives and the desire to leave, was some defiance on the part of Ukrainians. And they really expressed, most of the people that we talked to, a desire to stand up to Putin and not allow his intimidation campaign to cow them.
Yeah, you know, Missy, staying with you, I've seen that Gallup polling, which says a huge majority of Ukrainians said we should fight till we win. But at the same time, President Zelensky is saying, what, 30% of the power stations have been destroyed in the last week. I think he said 8 days, actually. Is there fear amongst Ukrainian leadership that the support for fighting till they win will erode in cold winter when they are cold?
I don't think so. I think that if there are concerns related to energy, it's more about support in Europe. And as consumers in countries like Germany and Slovakia and Poland face higher energy prices, whether or not that'll erode the support there, Ukrainians are already taking measures to ration their electricity. We saw that actually in the days after the first attacks when I was still there, was, much of the city was dark. They're deploying additional police patrols to help keep people safe in those conditions. And Ukrainians, we actually saw people running out to buy power banks and things that they think that they'll need if there are these rolling power cuts that were imposed temporarily and really could come back in full force.
You know, Carol, do you share that perspective? I have to say the so-called weaponizing of winter strategy of Putin's, I feared would be far more effective than Missy suggests it may be within Ukraine I'm talking about. Do you share her analysis?
I think I agree. I think the Ukrainians, from what I've been reading among which is her reporting. I think that it's pretty clear that for the moment, at least, there's tremendous Ukrainian resolve. I do worry that if it's a particularly harsh winter, that it'll be very difficult for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans, for that matter.
But Carol, with the Europeans, Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, was with us on the radio yesterday, and he mentioned that one of the few good things that come from this horror show is that the embrace of renewables in Western Europe is on the uptick. It's increasing dramatically. But how about Western European ally support for the Ukrainians when an energy crisis sets in there?
Well, I've actually been surprised at the resolve demonstrated thus far by all of our European allies, much more than I would have expected, actually. And I have to say, maybe it's putting on my Kremlinological hat a little bit. I worry that some of the demonstrations we've seen, as in Prague and in several other cities, are somehow instigated by the Russians, because if there's any tension at all, it could be played to their advantage, and we know they're pretty good at that. So I worry that they're the Europeans are getting hit, in a sense, both ways.
I'd like to see that Kremlinological hat sometime, Carol, by the way.
Anytime.
Missy, you wrote a day or two ago about the concerns in Ukraine about the midterms back here in the United States. I think most of us know the resolve of Republicans to support Ukraine is nowhere near as strong as that of Joe Biden and his Democratic Party. How worried are they about this support dissipating come January if the Republicans at least take over the House of Representatives?
Yeah, well, I was to say the Ukrainian political establishment is incredibly attuned to the dynamics within the U.S. Congress, and they're tracking it extremely closely. And I think, there is certainly concern that if certain Republicans win certain races, that there could be problems for them ahead. At the same time, those concerns are allayed to a certain extent by the relatively strong bipartisan consensus that we've seen, which is remarkable in and of itself at this time of partisan divisions, by the establishment Republicans and the Democrats. So even though that there's this growing chorus from the sort of far-right Republicans, mostly in the House, the Republican leadership in both chambers is still strongly supportive of Ukraine. So I guess it's a question of how those Republican leaders, if they do take control of one or both chambers, manage that.
Carol, I would worry about where the far right goes in the House and the influence they'll have with a potential Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. So if one does worry about that, is one of the goals to speed up whatever shipments of weaponry or any other kind of aid we're providing, air shields, whatever the hell it is that the U.S. has pledged to do for Ukraine?
I'm sure that there's a push and there's contemplation of trying to speed up deliveries of whatever we are going to be providing to the Ukrainians. We seem every day, there's another article in the paper or in what I'm reading on social media about, well, we're shipping X or we're shipping Y. And the latest discussion, of course, is about air defense after this massive attack on Kyiv and Dnipro and some of the other cities over the last week and a half.
Can we go from D.C. to Russia, Missy, for the last couple of minutes? When I read these stories the last couple of days about Putin grabbing people off the street, out of cafes, they're busking in certain communities to bring them into the military, which not only suggests to me a sense of desperation that is epic, I say to myself, what kind of citizenry supports this kind of thing? Are they willing to tolerate this action on top of everything else from Putin and continue to support his initiatives?
I think it's a really good question, and I spent a lot of time talking to Ukrainians about this to the extent they are speaking to relatives and analyzing the Russian sentiment. It's difficult to know because there's little reliable polling and people feel the need to self-censor. But to a large extent. But we really have seen dissent break into the open in a very unusual way from certain, influential commentators and people in the political establishment in Russia, which does suggest that there is this growing dissatisfaction with the way the war is going. And clearly the mobilization is deeply unpopular. So, I don't have any, I think what is harder to know is the extent to which Russians were okay with the war before that. And, people will say that there's a sort of apathy. People feel checked out from politics because they've been systematically disempowered over the course of several decades now. But, I think it is really difficult to know just because of the nature of Russian society right now.
What kind of vulnerability does this create for Putin, Carol?
I think it's a really interesting question. Can I go back to something Missy just said?
You can do anything you want, sure.
Thank you. I think that on the one hand, we know that the mobilization has really been a dismal failure because over 300,000 people are reported to have fled Russia. Many of them are in Kazakhstan and Georgia, any place they could go where they didn't need a visa. So I think that even if people aren't publicly criticizing Putin or the war effort, that people whose sons, husbands, whatever, are suddenly no longer in the country or are cannon fodder on the front lines are going to be very upset about what's going on. But we did need to differentiate that from the public criticism that Missy was also referring to, because those are coming from military bloggers and from really hardliners, people who support the war effort, but don't think that Putin has been tough enough. And there's a lot of speculation that this wave of attacks on Ukraine in the last 2 weeks are spurred by Putin's desire to say, see, I'm really tough and I'm determined to pursue the war effort to sort of shut up the dissent on the hard line. I don't know whether it's right or left.
Missy, I only have a couple of seconds left, but ordinarily when I'm talking about Ukraine on the show, I do it with Carol and Tom Nichols, who writes the Peacefield newsletter for The Atlantic. And when I asked them, when is this war over, they both said in sync, it's over when Putin's over. Is that the perspective that Ukrainian leaders and people feel, that until Putin's gone, Russia won't be gone?
I think many Ukrainians share that sentiment. In fact, President Zelensky has explicitly committed himself to that goal. Obviously anything could change, but he has said that he will not hold talks with Putin until there's a different leader. So that sort of creates all these complications with Zelensky's Western backers who are not committing to a goal of regime change.
Missy, your reporting is terrific. I really appreciate your time tonight. And Carol, it's great to see you as always. Thank you both.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks.